This week is all about how to manage pests using an integrated pest management approach, or IPM. Now, because there are a number of slides and many important learning objectives this week, I decided to break up this week's lecture into some smaller, more manageable parts so that you can go back and review specific concepts rather than just posting one giant long lecture that you would have to wade through to get at specific information. So in part one of this lecture series, we're going to look at the basic strategies behind IPM and how it differs from other more traditional pest management techniques. You guys are also going to learn about what organisms qualify as pests, the components of IPM, and you'll also see some of the challenges associated with identifying pests, but there are many resources that are going to be out there that can help you, and I'll give you some suggestions there as well. So to set the stage and help us define what we mean by IPM, how it differs from traditional pest management, it's going to be really important to first understand the type of system that we're working in. So being able to approach pest management through the lens of IPM means that we have to acknowledge that our farm or our garden is part of a larger ecosystem. And so in an ecosystem, we're considering both the living and the non-living components, as well as their interactions. So in other words, we're not just looking at individual organisms or pairwise interactions between organisms, like if you have an insect pest feeding on a plant. Instead, we have to zoom out and consider the entire network of potential interactions that could exist, interactions between the pest, its host plant, and the environment that they are living in, okay, and how that environment affects these organisms. So unlike traditional pest management, IPM is very much an ecosystem-based strategy. It takes a very big picture approach to managing a given organism. Another important part of IPM is going to be observation. And this involves gathering information about the different parts of the ecosystem. Being a good observer means monitoring or scouting your plants regularly, gathering data so that you can make informed decisions, okay? And then lastly, as the name suggests, this is a method of pest management that integrates many different methods. It acknowledges that there's not just one universal fix to get rid of a pest problem. You usually have to use multiple different methods at the same time to strive for long-term pest management. So it's not a quick fix sort of situation. So in IPM, it's also important to understand what and when organisms are considered to be pests. There are many different types of organisms that might become a pest at some point, and they vary a lot in terms of their classification, their biology, their size, and their potential impact on the farm or the landscape. Just some examples here: weeds, so other plants that you're growing can be considered pests. Invertebrates, which is a very diverse group, including arthropods like insects, mites, mollusks like snails, even slugs and nematodes underground are all part of the invertebrate group. Many vertebrates are pretty good pests, especially around here. We have tons of rodents like squirrels and mice and rabbits. Gophers are a big issue we deal with, but even birds and tiny humans can be vertebrate pests as well. Pathogens and diseases are another very diverse and interesting group. This includes all the microorganisms that can cause diseases in plants, includes fungi, bacteria, and even viruses. So chances are all of these types of organisms are present on the farm, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are pests and require any kind of management. In fact, most organisms that exist on the farm or in our garden are actually completely benign and in some cases are even beneficial. So we don't want to take the steps to try to manage them. They're perfectly fine, doing no harm. But in order to be considered or characterized as a pest, that organism has to, by definition, limit the growth of a desired plant or maybe animal in some way. So the organism has to reduce maybe the availability of that plant or animal, the quality or the value of, say, a crop in some way by maybe causing physical or cosmetic damage, or it can even change things at the biochemical level. It could change the flavor profile of a crop, or it may even decrease your overall quantity or yield of a particular product. And there are a couple mechanisms by which this can happen. So first, the pest might directly compete with resources with, say, your crop plants or animals on the farm. So competition is a big one. Directly inhibiting the growth or development. A good example here are like weeds that release allelochemicals into the soil that will actually prevent the germination of some plants. So they're directly inhibiting the ability of that plant to germinate and grow. So that would be considered a pest. Another example would be if that organism carries a disease. So it's a vector for disease pathogens. Many insect pests are good vectors for disease. And organisms that exist at a level to cause economic losses are also those that are considered pests. So there is a very much a economic side to IPM. Basically, it means that that pest has to exist at a level to cause you to lose money. So yeah, so money losses, but also this could also mean like health problems or inconvenience to production. So there's some kind of profit loss, whether that be money or some kind of risk to the production pipeline. Okay. So these are the mechanisms by which that organism limits the growth or the quality or the availability of that plant or animal. So that's the pest part of integrated pest management. Now, if we look at the last part of the phrase, the management part, this comes down to the plan that you're putting into place, or the decision-making process that tells you when and how you are going to act to control a particular pest. So to just briefly summarize that basic concept, this is a definition from the USDA. It talks about IPM as being a sustainable approach to managing pests. And it does this by combining different types of tools, what are called biological, cultural, physical, and even chemical tools in ways that minimize economic, health, and environmental risks. So again, this is a very multidisciplinary approach that combines lots of different methods and tools to manage pests rather than just relying on one tool and a quick fix to the situation. So this is an ecosystem-based strategy. And unlike other types of pest control, we're looking at strategies that are going to focus on long-term prevention of pests or their damage through a combination of techniques. So this is the foundation of a good IPM program. Very ecological based pest management. We're applying ecology principles for the most part to our farm or our garden. It means also acting to control pests only after you have made adequate observations. You have monitored and collected data and have proof that there is some need that you need to control the pest, okay? It's not just identifying some damage on a plant and saying, okay, I need to get rid of that insect or whatever that pest organism is. So lots of monitoring, lots of collecting data and research to make informed decisions again. IPM also means relying on lots of different techniques. We're including different types of controls, which we're going to go through in another lecture. It's a very preventative approach. We are doing things that are going to avoid, allowing pests to get to a certain population level where they're going to cause harm. And when we do select methods to manage, after prevention hasn't worked, after what are called cultural controls haven't worked, we are going to choose methods and apply them in a manner that is going to avoid risking our health, the health of other organisms on the farm that are the not targeted pests, maybe beneficials, and we're going to do things to minimize the risks to the environment. Okay. So that's the overall philosophy of IPM. If we wanted to do just a quick side-by-side comparison, comparing IPM to what I call just the standard pest control methods, this is like standard pest control like pre-1960s, we can compare them in the general mindset that each of these programs have. We could also compare them in terms of like their overall goal and the methods that they generally use. So if we were to look at the mindset, standard pest control is very reactive to pest problems. So you identify outbreaks and then have to solve the issue very quickly, usually. IPM, though, is a little bit more like planning ahead sort of strategy where you're going to apply prevention techniques, like choosing plants that are really well adapted to an environment or using practices that build up your farm's biodiversity. You might do things like practice crop rotation or plant biodiverse areas in your farm design. These all kind of fall under a group of preventative tools called cultural care, cultural controls. So you're planning ahead, you're putting in a lot of forethought rather than waiting until it gets to be an issue and having to react very quickly. Okay. So that's the general differences in the mindset. In terms of the goals, when you realize that there's a pest issue, if you were to just be following like standard pest control strategies, you would be focused on trying to eradicate the pest. So this is very much the mindset of I need to kill off the entire pest population immediately, rather than focus on IPM, which is being okay with there being pests on the farm, just making sure that those pest levels are at a manageable population. So some pests are fine as long as they are low enough and the populations of those organisms are diverse enough that the certain thresholds aren't being reached. Okay, so it emphasizes minimizing the pest population to an acceptable level. And that's going to be important because it's actually going to decrease the chances of pesticide resistance developing or running into issues like secondary pest outbreaks. So low diverse populations is sort of the goal here, not kill all the things on my farm. When you compare the methods in standard pest control and IPM, methods are drastically different. So this is very much a chemically intensive strategy, widespread pesticide use. This is why we have pesticide resistance and pest resurgence and secondary pest outbreaks happening, as you're going to see later in another mini lecture from the series. IPM, again, multiple integrated methods. Doesn't mean that chemicals are completely ruled out. You may need to rely on chemicals in IPM, but you're usually going to use chemicals in combination with other methods. Okay, so chemicals are the last resort here. So there are a few key components that are necessary to carry out an effective integrated pest management program. The first is to try, as I mentioned earlier, to prevent pest issues whenever possible, not let pests get out of control. If you wait until your crop has been completely decimated, the only option you might have is a fast-acting pesticide. So we don't want to wait till we get to that point. So in order for this to not happen, you need to properly learn to identify symptoms and pests correctly. So you need to get out there and do some research. And then once you know what pests and symptoms you're looking for, monitoring frequently is going to help identify when they are going to become an issue. So scouting for those organisms, doing weekly or monthly surveys for those pests and identifying the levels at which you need to act. Okay, so this is going to form the basis of deciding certain thresholds, which are called action thresholds. This is the threshold that defines the point at which you will need to step in and start to actually manage the pest. Okay, so these are a critical part of IPM, defining an action threshold. And then if that action threshold is reached, you will step in to manage the pest using a specific pathway, beginning with the least intrusive methods. Usually you don't just rely on one method, you combine lots of different methods in the strategy here. So most of the time you might see IPM depicted as something like this figure here, or maybe some version of this triangle, this decision-making triangle. So this kind of walks through the methods that you would use if you would reach that action threshold and you need to start managing your pest. So you always start with prevention, the bottom here, which also kind of includes cultural care or sanitation practices. These are the foundation of IPM. Farmers always going to try to prevent the pest problem with regular monitoring. But then if you do have some evidence to support that it needs further management techniques, you're going to just work your way up the triangle. Okay, so you're going to start with physical and mechanical controls, then move on to what are called biological controls, and then resorting to chemicals as your last option. So again, IPM doesn't mean chemical free. It just means that if you do rely on chemicals, that you have exhausted all of these other options below the chemical option on the triangle. And it also means that if you are to try pesticides or some kind of chemical control, you're using them in conjunction with other things, not just going right to the chemical option. All right, so that's the main strategy. So prevention and cultural care are essentially the cornerstones of IPM. This means that you're going to try to create the right environment for your plants. You need to first identify what are the essential things that my plants need, and how can I supply all of those things like light, carbon dioxide, water, good soil, nutrition. How do I make sure I get all of those things to my plants so that they are set up to succeed? We want to have healthy, stress-free plants so that they're set up well and they can actually defend themselves from potential pests. Another part of preventing pests also means having a really good understanding of when plants are going to be most vulnerable to pests and doing things to protect them during these very vulnerable stages. So in the figure here, we have the stages of plant growth from the seedling stage all the way up to an older, more mature vegetative stage. In this early growth, this early germination to early seedling development, these are going to be the times when those plants are super vulnerable. And this is going to be the most important stage to watch out for pests. So plant tissues during this early growth stage are usually softer. They're more nutritious. They contain lots of nitrogen and amino acids. And so they're super attractive and tasty to pests. The other downside is that young seedlings generally don't have all of their like chemical and physical defenses set up, not so well developed. So they could be really quickly just decimated by insects or rabbits, which we've had happen on numerous occasions on the farm at campus. So we need to, acknowledge that this stage is super important to monitor, and we need to protect our plants with floating row cover or cages, or just raise our seedlings in the greenhouse or in a protected spot. Okay. Now, probably one of the most challenging, but also one of the most important parts of IPM is to correctly identify the pests themselves and the symptoms they might create. And this is critical because proper identification is necessary in order to know how to correctly manage those pest problems. So some of the things that make Pest ID particularly challenging is the fact that pests may no longer be present when you go to monitor. And then you're left with trying to identify a pest based solely on symptoms that are present or signs of damage, like this guy here, trying to figure out what could be causing this giant hole in his wall. So that's the analogy. The other issue is that pests are sometimes really difficult to find. You might see symptoms, but don't know where they're coming from. Maybe it's because the pest is feeding below ground. So you don't physically see damage, but you see other symptoms happening above ground. And this is usually the case for things that are in the soil, like pathogens and nematodes, or even, insect damage from below ground. The other challenge having to do with pest ID and diagnosis is the fact that the presence of a pest doesn't always mean that it caused the damage. A lot of damage looks similar, and so trying to figure out the who did it situation is often a big challenge that we run into. And then the other thing is that not all damage actually needs to be treated. So a little bit of damage to your plants can actually be good because it helps the plant signal to the predatory insects that there's food sources around and they need to come take care of those pests for you. So remember, we want to try to have a diversity of organisms that are coexisting at low levels rather than eradicate an entire group from the farm. So if we do notice some damage on our plants, you don't need to freak out and nuke your entire farm. This is important to maintain those ecological interactions between beneficial insects like predatory wasps and things like that, and our insect pests. Okay, and this is why, as part of IPM, we need to define thresholds of damage. Some damage is tolerated, and it's only when we exceed a particular level, that's when we have to act to suppress a pest. So that's where action thresholds come into play. Now, another big challenge to pest identification is that many symptoms and signs of plants look very similar, especially to the untrained eye. So I just put two examples to illustrate this point. So the plant on the left here has both galls from root knot nematode, and it also has nodules up here from nitrogen fixing bacteria, which are a beneficial organism. So if you didn't know the differences between these two, you might think that it's either all nodules from bacteria, or maybe it's all root knot nematode, and you would go crazy and try to treat your soil. But if you dug into the literature and did a little research or talked to farmers who have seen these sorts of things before, you would eventually learn that you could actually try to rub both of these things off of the roots with your finger. And if the nodules fell off really easily when you tried to rub the plant roots, that would be nitrogen fixing bacteria. The galls from root knot nematode don't really rub off easily. So, but they look very similar and might be easily misdiagnosed. Another example here, this is from an IPM website from the University of California. This is just looking at symptoms of grub damage on the right and herbicide damage on the left. Both of these things kind of create these splotchy yellow patches of foliage, and they can be easily confused. Okay. So diagnosing the problem will no doubt require some detective work on your part. You could take a look at like historical patterns in your area. It's helpful to talk to local farmers and growers and get a sense of what issues you might run into before even beginning. It's a good place to start, but I also know that, there are some symptoms that might be the result of other things going on, not just the pest, but could be related to the climate or nutrient levels or machinery, inadequate irrigation, or multiple factors kind of working together to create a particular symptom. All right. So just as an example here, this seedling here is showing a disease, a fungal disease called damping off. And it's commonly the result of bad weather conditions. So if the seedling is growing in a cool, wet condition, creates the right environment for that fungi to start to grow and prosper. So the way you would manage that is by managing the environmental conditions, not going out and buying a fungicide to get rid of the fungus. That's not going to help. Okay. So lots of challenges here with identification and trying to learn common symptoms and signs of pests. But one of the good things out there is that there are a myriad resources and specialists that are designed to help you here. And this slide basically summarizes some of the resources that I have found most useful from my experience in pest management. One of the first places I usually point people is University of California, Davis has an awesome website, IPM website dedicated to common pests in California, how to manage them. And on the UC IPM site, they have tons of diagnostic tools. There are pictures, and they even list out, organically acceptable methods that align with IPM. They even have a really good series of textbooks out there if you're interested in getting hard copies of resources. And the one shown here on the slide is my personal favorite for this sort of application, Pests of the Garden and Small Farm, really nicely geared towards small scale farms, even home gardeners. And it covers tons of different pests, from insects to mites and diseases and even weeds. And it focuses in on fruit and nut trees, vegetables, and herbs, which is kind of cool. So talks about, identification, biology, management practices, and they cover like over 100 different common pests. And the nice thing about this book and other textbooks from UC IPM is that they often organize symptoms into tables and organize them by crop. So if you know what type of crop you're growing, you can kind of go right to that crop page and take a look at what are some of the common issues that that particular plant might run into. So I like the way they organize it. I would also not be afraid to reach out to any of these experts in our area. You could talk to local farmers. You could visit, your local nursery and talk to the folks there. You could also reach out to master gardeners, talk to the farm advisors at UC Cooperative Extension. The folks there are specialists and professionally trained to identify pests and also help you make the right decisions to how to manage them. So that's my plug for all these awesome resources. Take advantage of some of these, especially if you're struggling to identify particular pests on the farm.